Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. This guy hoisted himself by his own petard. How dumb he must be to not remember picking up an overtime shift to cover. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. You want HR involved? Yep, you can have HR. I work in radiology. About 15 plus years ago, I was working with a radiographer, x-ray tech, called Smith. Now, Smith had recently received 2 official warnings of duty, one for abusing the boss and one for abusing me. Smith was told to change their attitude and behave. Smith, however, went on a path of revenge that was endless. I was dying a death of 1,000 tiny paper cuts. Nothing terrible, but just lots of little things, which I knew Smith had done, but I couldn't prove it. One Monday morning, one of the A&E doctors came over to complain about how poor the x-ray image quality was a couple nights ago. Smith goes over the roster board and sees my name corresponding to that shift. You worked afternoon shift by yourself. Smith charges into the boss's office demanding a full complaint process. Smith demands, since clearly the boss and I have it in for them, HR should run it independently. The boss tries to talk Smith out of it, but Smith basically says they don't trust the boss to deal with me fairly. The boss tells Smith he will hand it over, but be careful of what you ask for. Apparently, Smith was in quite a lather and so excited that they had got me. 2 days later, I'm being interviewed by 2 HR guys and an independent chief radiographer from another hospital. We go through each of the images, and I agree the work is really poor. It's clear no one has actually looked too carefully at the paperwork with the x-ray images. The HR guys finally ask why you did such poor work. I reply, I didn't. And if they bothered to look on the online pay system, I called in sick that day. In fact, Smith had done the overtime shift. They looked stunned. I reminded them I expected the same process for Smith. I also lodged an official complaint about false allegations be made by Smith for this case. Apparently, Smith tried to stick to the roster, but they showed Smith their pay slip, plus that they had signed off on all the images. While HR was deciding what to do with Smith, fire them or not, Smith had 2 more incidents at work and was eventually fired. Edit. Answer to some of your questions. 1. When Smith got fired, HR went to town and dug up every little bit of dirt on Smith so they couldn't claim wrongful dismissal. 2. HR had a 3-step process in reviewing all formal complaints. First, interview all parties with an independent, decide if there's a case, and have a HR tribunal meeting with union involvement, and lastly, make a finding. They were hopeless. I could write 400 pages about HR and crap that went down. I found out the head of HR rose through the ranks over 30 years, starting as a 16-year-old who hadn't finished high school, started working in the 1970s. HR had no access to RIS or PACS. The chief radiographer, who was independent, had no prior chance to review stuff, merely an expert for image quality. The chief worked for the organization at another site, hence no privacy issue as we shared a PACS. 3. Use of radiographic markers. Always do, but Smith got caught using mine by me. Took it to HR, who told me Smith hadn't technically broken policy. I purchased generic R and L markers after that, and so did half the staff. I also caught Smith eating my lunch, and HR told me Smith hadn't done anything wrong technically because I hadn't labeled my lunch. Come time to fire Smith, and they were all over this like a rash. 4. My boss was well aware of who worked and was happy to deal with it, but Smith wanted HR. My boss was more than happy to see Smith dig themselves an almighty hole. 5. Did Smith take bad x-rays on purpose? I don't think so. I think Smith's mental health was crashing at this point. The work reflected their mental health. And our second story. The time I followed a customer back to his house. A while back when I was 16, I'd taken a job at a local grocery store. I lived in a small town, and eventually, though the store was small, it was the largest one in the county. I'd worked there for 2 months at the local grocery store when this occurrence had happened. I was nearing the end of my shift on a Saturday afternoon. It hadn't been a particularly day, despite it being a weekend, and I can recall myself quite bored when the old man walked into the store. The old man, whose name I'll change for the sake of the story to David, had been a regular customer, spending a few $100s a week. He was usually upbeat and enthusiastic, but today he was distant and fatigued. "How are you doing, sir?" I asked from behind the counter. "Okay, it's been a long day," David replied without his usual cheer. He then shuffled away into the aisles. Minutes passed, and I waited patiently in the seat, which was positioned behind the cash register. But after a while, I went to look for him to see if he needed any assistance. I searched the store, caressing overstocked aisles with a looking eye when I finally found him in the far right corner. David had a cheap 12-pack of beer in one hand and was examining the different ropes with another. "Hello, David," I said. The store staff were quite friendly with the old man, or at least enough that we called him by his first name. "Do you need any help with anything?" "Which rope do you think is the strongest?" There were only 4 different types of rope, and I honestly had completely no clue which one was the most durable, so I picked at random, pointing at a blue one. Then he gave me a measurement, and I cut the certain length, and then took the rope to the cash register so he could pay. David followed slowly, a mopish jaunt. The receipt took a while to print. The printer was old and dawdling, and so after I'd scanned the rope and beer, I tried to converse with David. I looked at the rope and the weary expression on the old man's face. "Are you sure everything's okay?" "Could be better, could be worse," David said with stale tone. "All right then," I said, smiling. "Here's your receipt." As he walked out of the store, I went to my manager. I told him of the recent occurrence, and he was slightly concerned. David was a regular customer, spent a lot of money in the store, and also was the owner's good friend. So due to the fact that David lived about a block away, the manager had the bright idea of sending me out to monitor the old man. I walked out of the store with a hoodie on. It was nearly spring, but it was still brisk outside. My breath misted faintly in the air. I walked down the street, trailing David, feeling like a total moron. Fortunately, I had an MP3 player in my pocket so I could listen to music while doing my detective research. After 2 corners, David's house was in sight, and I decided to wait it out on a bench in front of an auto store about 50 yards away from the shabby 2-story house. 10 minutes passed without anything eventful. Then 15 minutes, 20 minutes. But after about maybe 25 minutes, I saw David. The old man's backyard was surrounded by a tall wooden fence and had a huge branched oak tree in the middle. David was ambling up the tree's broad branches with the blue rope coiled around his arm. When he reached the middle branch, he stopped and tied the end of the rope around it in a wide knot. He then descended back down the oak and disappeared behind the wooden fence. Another bout of minutes passed. I felt a nervous twinge of expected excitement in my chest. The rope glared at me like an impending doom. The afternoon sun was setting, and it loomed over David's house with a glaring tint. I had to squint my eyes at the house, and even then it was hard to see. The sun continued to decline. It grew colder, and I grew more jittery with every moment. The blue rope swayed in a slight breeze. Finally, a figure appeared. 2 figures, actually, to stand on top of the fence frame. One the slim frame of a young girl, the other of the old man. David had the rope held in his hand, but quickly put it around the girl's neck? I couldn't tell with the distance, but the way the girl was shaking shrieked of approaching disaster. I stood up abruptly, yanking out my earbuds with a contorted twist of my hand, and began to amble towards the house. Everything was as if it was in slow motion. My feet speeding forward faster than I ever think they've gone before. David shoving the rope on the top of the fence connected to the rope tied to the branch of the oak tree. "Holy hell!" I shouted. A scream sounded from the other side of the fence, and the rope went slack. I scaled the wooden fence with an untapped agility, landing on the other side with a heavy thud. I once again stood up, scanning the grass lawn with ninja-like eyes. There was David, standing on top of the fence, smiling down at the frame of a girl who held the slender blue rope in her hands. 2 other girls were standing underneath the tree, yelling words of encouragement, but they stopped abruptly when they saw the sight of me, a hooded teenager with eyes pulsing with adrenaline. I stared at them awkwardly, then turned to David and apologized profusely. It turns out those were his grandkids, and he was caring for them for the weekend. The reason he'd looked so distant and fatigued was because, well, he'd been caring for 3 grandkids for the weekend. The rope was used for a rope swing to entertain his granddaughters. After I told why I'd so unexpectedly appeared in his back lawn, he laughed almost as profusely as I had apologized. It became a joke between us and the store, and the story was told for years afterward. And our last story. Hired my friend as my employee, then fired her. I work in interior design for a federal government agency, and it's been a wonderful career that's provided for me and my family for over 15 years. Last year, I met a friend at church, Angela, and I eventually learned Angela was out of work and looking for a job. She'd done office work before, and because I'm in a managerial position, I thought it'd be great to hire her in an underlying role that was open at my job, especially with government work being very stable and secure. I thought it'd be a great fit for her. Her criminal record was clean, but she told me she had a few traffic tickets that she couldn't afford to pay the fines for, so I helped her pay those so her background check could clear. So to make it clear, I've helped her a lot, but slowly but surely, working with her has been hell. She sometimes doesn't get work done on time. She often swings by my office to just gossip. I've tried to walk her through the work and explain to her in great detail how to accomplish tasks, but she struggles very easily. She's had spats with fellow coworkers and other employees of mine. It's starting to get to the point that my boss is starting to complain. She also threatened to fire several employees because she's a close friend of mine. I'd been wrestling what to do for over a year and really trying to make it work, which incredibly stressed me out all year long. I probably talked my husband's ear off every night debating what to do, but I finally pulled the plug and fired her. I also no longer answer her calls on my personal cell phone, and after my daughter, 13-year-old female, one day answered the phone and heard Angela's voice, my daughter hung up right after she said hello, to which Angela left a very long, quite passive-aggressive voicemail on my cell phone. She burned her own opportunity. That's not your fault. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.